The bell echoed through the empty hallways of Eastwood High School, marking the start of another day. Students shuffled into their classrooms, their chatter blending into a symphony of adolescent energy. Outside, a lone figure hurried across the parking lot, juggling a stack of papers, a coffee cup, and a bag that threatened to spill its contents. His breath came in short bursts as he glanced at his watch and muttered under his breath, "Not again." Mr. Carter had been teaching at Eastwood for 3 years. His classroom was a sanctuary for students who didn't feel seen elsewhere, a place where they could ask questions without fear and explore ideas that often sparked debates lasting well beyond the bell. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a mentor, a confidant, and to many of his students, a hero. But lately, a storm had been brewing just below the surface. The principal, Mr. Davis, had always run the school with precision. He valued order and punctuality above all else, and every staff member knew he didn't tolerate even the smallest deviation from the rules. That's why, when Mr. Carter walked into the school 15 minutes late for the third time that month, a decision was already waiting for him in the principal's office. The students noticed when Mr. Carter didn't show up for homeroom. Whispers spread through the halls like wildfire. Did he call in sick? No way, I saw him running in earlier. What if he's in trouble? Meanwhile, in the brightly lit office adorned with motivational posters and a clock ticking ominously, Mr. Carter sat across from the principal. The tension was thick. "You know why you're here," Mr. Davis began, his tone clipped and formal. "I've given you multiple warnings about your tardiness, and yet, here we are again." Mr. Carter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, and I take full responsibility. But if you just let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Mr. Davis interrupted. "This isn't personal, it's about setting an example. Your actions have consequences, and I have no choice but to dismiss you from your position." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Mr. Carter blinked, trying to process what he just heard. Dismissed? Over being late? It felt surreal, unjust. But before he could argue, the principal's phone buzzed, signaling the end of their conversation. Word of Mr. Carter's dismissal spread faster than anyone expected. Students were stunned, and parents began calling the school demanding answers. For the staff, it was a grim reminder of the strict policies they worked under. But what no one could have predicted was what the principal would do next. As the school day progressed, students gathered in small groups, some near tears, others visibly angry. Mr. Carter's classroom sat empty, a poignant symbol of his absence. But in the principal's office, Mr. Davis sat deep in thought, staring at a folder on his desk labeled Carter. Something about this didn't sit right with him. For all his flaws, Mr. Carter had always been one of the most dedicated teachers in the building. Could a few late arrivals really overshadow years of impact? Just as Mr. Davis reached for the phone to make a call, a knock at the door interrupted him. What he saw when he opened it made him freeze in place, his jaw tightening. What happened next would change everything for the school, the students, and Mr. Carter himself. The knock echoed in the quiet office, pulling Mr. Davis from his thoughts. He straightened his tie, a habit he always fell back on when he felt uneasy, and walked to the door. Opening it, he was met with the unexpected sight of a group of students, their faces a mix of determination and worry. At the front of the group stood a girl clutching a notebook tightly to her chest, her hands trembling slightly but her eyes locked on the principal's. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice steady despite the clear tension in the room, "we need to talk about Mr. Carter." The principal frowned, glancing past her at the cluster of students spilling into the hallway. He could feel the weight of their gazes, each one silently demanding an explanation. "This is neither the time nor the place," he said firmly, stepping aside to signal the conversation was over. But the girl didn't move. Instead, she opened her notebook and pulled out a stack of handwritten letters. "These are from us," she said, her voice gaining strength. "From the students. We're asking you to reconsider." Mr. Davis glanced at the papers but didn't take them. "I understand your concern," he replied, his tone measured, "but decisions like these are not made lightly." Mr. Carter's dismissal was necessary. Necessary? Another student interjected, his voice rising. "He's the only teacher who actually listens to us. Do you even know what he's been going through?" The question caught Mr. Davis off guard. He hadn't expected the students to challenge him so directly, and for a moment he felt a flicker of doubt. But he quickly brushed it aside. "This isn't a discussion," he said, his voice firm. "Now all of you need to get back to class before you face consequences of your own." The students exchanged glances, reluctant to leave, but the girl in front finally nodded. "We'll go," she said quietly, "but this isn't over." As they turned to leave, Mr. Davis shut the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. He felt the weight of their words, but he couldn't let it show. Rules were rules, and his job was to enforce them, no matter how unpopular the decisions might be. Back in the hallways, the students regrouped near the lockers. "He doesn't care," one of them muttered, kicking at the floor. "It's like Mr. Carter didn't even matter to him." "He mattered to us," the girl replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And we're not giving up. If the principal won't listen, we'll find another way." The group nodded in agreement, their resolve hardening. They began brainstorming ideas, from petitions to organizing a sit-in. For them, this wasn't just about a teacher being late, it was about standing up for someone who had always stood up for them. Meanwhile, in his empty classroom, Mr. Carter sat alone, staring at the rows of desks that had once been filled with eager faces. He felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of failure. He had always prided himself on being there for his students, but now he wondered if he had let them down. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from one of his students. "We're fighting for you," it read. "Don't give up." The message brought a lump to his throat. He couldn't let them do this alone, but he also knew he couldn't step foot in the school again without risking further consequences. For now, all he could do was wait and hope that the students' voices would be enough to make a difference. Unbeknownst to him, Mr. Davis was wrestling with his own doubts. That folder on his desk wasn't just a record of tardies, it also contained glowing evaluations, letters of recommendation, and notes from students about how Mr. Carter had changed their lives. As he read through them, a question lingered in his mind: had he made a mistake? The day ended with more questions than answers. Students went home, still buzzing with ideas for how to help their teacher. Mr. Carter tried to distract himself, but his thoughts kept circling back to his classroom and the faces he might never see again. And Mr. Davis sat alone in his office, staring at clock and wondering what the right decision really looked like. But the next morning, everything changed. When Mr. Davis arrived at the school, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. The front lawn was filled with students, parents, and even a few teachers, all holding signs and chanting, "Bring back Mr. Carter." The scene was impossible to ignore, and for the first time, Mr. Davis realized this was bigger than just one teacher being late. As he pushed through the crowd, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Standing at the center of the group was Mr. Carter himself, holding a sign that read, "I'll fight for them if they fight for me." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither man spoke. But in that silence, the real story was just beginning. The protest outside Eastwood High buzzed with energy. Students held signs scrawled with bold, heartfelt messages: "Justice for Mr. Carter. Our teacher, our voice. Being late isn't a crime." Parents stood in solidarity, some holding coffee cups as they spoke with reporters who had shown up to cover the unusual scene. The chants grew louder, weaving into a collective demand for change. Mr. Davis watched from the window of his office, his face unreadable. He hadn't expected this level of backlash. In his years as principal, he had dealt with angry parents, upset students, and even disagreements among staff, but never anything like this. The sight of Mr. Carter standing in the center of the crowd added a layer of complexity he wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just about a dismissal anymore, it had become a movement. Down on the lawn, Mr. Carter stood among his students, feeling equal parts humbled and uneasy. He hadn't planned to come, but when he heard about the protest, something inside him told him he couldn't stay away. The students' passion reminded him why he had become a teacher in the first place, but he worried about what this might mean for them. Would they face consequences for their actions? Would this escalate further? One of the parents, a woman holding the hand of a young girl, approached him. "Mr. Carter, you've made such a difference in my daughter's life," she said, her voice full of emotion. "When she was struggling last year, you took the time to help her. She came home excited to learn again because of you. We're here because we believe in you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He thanked her quietly, trying to keep his emotions in check. Around him, students and parents were sharing similar stories with each other and the reporters. It was clear this wasn't just about tardiness anymore, it was about the impact one person could have on an entire community. Inside the school, teachers whispered about the unfolding scene. Some felt conflicted, unsure of where they stood. Mr. Davis had always been a fair leader, albeit strict, and they didn't want to jeopardize their jobs by openly supporting Mr. Carter. Others, however, felt a growing sense of unease. They had seen firsthand how much Mr. Carter cared for his students, and the idea of him being dismissed over a rule felt wrong. A few quietly debated joining the protest, but fear held them back. As the day went on, the tension spread like wildfire. In the classrooms, students whispered about the protest and speculated about what might happen next. Some teachers tried to stick to their lessons, but it was clear their hearts weren't in it. The protest outside cast a long shadow over everything. Meanwhile, Mr. Davis sat at his desk, staring at the folder marked Carter once again. The stories he'd heard from students and parents over the years replayed in his mind. He remembered the shy freshman who had blossomed into a confident student under Mr. Carter's guidance, the struggling senior who had finally passed math because of his after-school tutoring sessions, and the countless students who had written about him in their college essays. Each story chipped away at his resolve. But rules were rules, weren't they? If he made an exception for Mr. Carter, what kind of message would that send to the rest of the staff? Would they see it as favoritism or weakness? These questions gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Outside, the protest showed no signs of slowing down. As the day wore on, more people joined, former students, community members, even a local activist who saw the dismissal as part of a larger issue about fairness in schools. The crowd's energy was electric, but it also carried an undercurrent of frustration that could easily tip into something more chaotic if not handled carefully. Back in his quiet apartment, Mr. Carter's absence was felt even more deeply. His bookshelves, once filled with lesson plans and student projects, now sat empty. His teaching awards, normally tucked away in a drawer, were scattered on the dining table, a painful reminder of what he had lost. As he sat there, scrolling through his phone and seeing updates about the protest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than him. It was about standing up for what was right, even if the odds were stacked against them. That evening, Mr. Davis received a phone call from the school district. The superintendent, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience, had been made aware of the protest and wasn't happy about it. "You need to get this under control, Davis," she said sharply. "We can't have this kind of attention on the district. Resolve it quickly, but don't backpedal on your decision. We can't afford to look weak." Her words weighed heavily on him. He knew she was right. In some ways the district's reputation was on the line, but something about the directive didn't sit well with him. As he hung up the phone, he felt the walls closing in. No matter what he did, it seemed someone would be unhappy. The next morning, Mr. Carter woke to a series of texts from his students. The protest had grown even larger overnight, and the story was now trending on social media. News outlets had picked it up, framing it as a fight for fairness and respect for educators. Some even questioned whether school policies were too rigid, sparking a broader debate about how teachers were treated in the education system. As he read through the messages, a thought began to take shape. This wasn't just about getting his job back anymore, it was about something bigger. The students, parents, and community were standing up not just for him, but for every teacher who had ever felt undervalued or dismissed. And if they were willing to fight, he knew he had to find a way to fight with them. But just as he was starting to feel hopeful, his phone buzzed with a message that made his stomach drop. It was from one of his colleagues, warning him that the school board was planning a meeting to address the protest. "They're trying to shut it down," the text read. "Be careful." The stakes had just been raised, and the outcome was more uncertain than ever. The crowd outside Eastwood High had doubled by the time the school day began. The buzz of conversations, camera flashes, and the rhythmic chants filled the air, making it impossible to ignore. Students who had initially hesitated to join the protest now found themselves swept up in the momentum. Even teachers peeked from the windows, some tempted to step outside and stand with the growing crowd. Inside, Mr. Davis paced his office. His nerves were frayed, and his usual composure seemed to be slipping. He had spent the night drafting statements, trying to balance district policies with the growing unrest. Every draft felt hollow, though, as if no words could address the deeper issues at play. The superintendent had called twice that morning, her voice sharper each time. "You need to contain this, Davis," she had said. "If this spirals any further, it'll reflect on all of us." But containing it wasn't as simple as it sounded. The students were resolute, their voices united. Parents were on their side, and the media's presence only amplified their demands. Every choice he could make seemed to come with severe consequences, not just for him but for the entire school. Mr. Carter stayed home that morning, watching live streams of the protest on his phone. He saw familiar faces holding signs and chanting, their passion palpable even through the screen. He couldn't help but feel proud, but a part of him was deeply uneasy. What if this escalated? What if his students ended up paying the price for standing up for him? The thought gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't sit idly by. They were fighting for him, and he had to do something. Meanwhile, back at the school, a group of students had taken their protest a step further. They marched through the halls, handing out flyers and calling on their peers to walk out of class. "If they won't listen to us out there, they'll have to listen to us in here," one of them said, his voice loud and confident. By lunchtime, the hallways were filled with students, their unified presence impossible to ignore. The school board's emergency meeting was set for that evening, and the tension leading up to it was palpable. Teachers whispered among themselves in the staff lounge, debating what might happen. Some worried about their own job security if they were seen as supporting the students, while others quietly cheered the protest from the sidelines. The divide among the staff was growing, but one thing was clear: no one could pretend this wasn't happening. As the day wore on, the protests outside continued to swell. Local news anchors reported live from the scene, interviewing parents and students who shared stories of how Mr. Carter had made a difference in their lives. A former student who had gone on to college spoke about how Mr. Carter's guidance had changed the trajectory of his future. "He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," the young man said, his voice cracking with emotion. Losing him would be a loss for everyone. The weight of those words hung in the air as Mr. Davis watched the broadcast from his office. He felt a pang of guilt he couldn't shake, but he also felt trapped. The district's policies were clear, and he had enforced them the way he was supposed to. But seeing the faces of the students and hearing their stories made him question whether following the rules had been the right choice. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the school board members began arriving for the meeting. Protesters lined the sidewalks, their chants growing louder as the officials walked past. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Davis sat at the head of the table, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The meeting began with a statement from the superintendent, emphasizing the importance of upholding district policies. But as parents and students were invited to speak, the tone quickly shifted. One by one, they shared stories of how Mr. Carter had impacted their lives, their voices filled with passion and urgency. Some pleaded for his reinstatement, while others criticized the rigidity of the rules that had led to his dismissal. Mr. Carter entered the room quietly, his presence drawing immediate attention. He didn't plan to speak, but as he listened to his students and their families, he felt a surge of emotion. When the last parent finished speaking, he stood up, his hands trembling slightly but his voice steady. "I never wanted this to turn into a spectacle," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "I became a teacher because I wanted to make a difference, to be the kind of mentor I wished I had when I was growing up. And if I'd done that for even one student, then I'd done my job." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "But this isn't about me anymore. This is about all the teachers who give everything they have and are still judged by a single mistake. It's about the students who are watching how we handle this and learning what it means to stand up for what's right. I know I've broken the rules, and I accept the consequences. But I ask you to consider what kind of message you want to send to this community." The room was silent as he sat down, his words hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly feeling the weight of the moment. Mr. Davis stared at the table in front of him, his mind racing. The decision they were about to make would define not only Mr. Carter's future but also the school's identity. Outside, the crowd waited anxiously for news. The tension in the air was electric, every passing moment adding to the suspense. The students who had organized the protest held hands, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. Parents murmured quietly among themselves, some praying for a positive outcome. As the meeting stretched into the evening, the stakes felt higher than ever. Every voice, every story, every argument had built up to this moment. And yet, no one knew what the final decision would be. The air inside the conference room was heavy with anticipation, every eye fixed on the school board members as they deliberated. Mr. Carter sat in the back, his heart pounding with every second that passed. He could hear the muffled chants from the crowd outside, their voices a constant reminder of what was at stake. It felt like the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for a decision that could either heal or divide them. Just as one of the board members leaned forward to speak, the door to the room creaked open, and a tall man in a crisp suit entered, his presence immediately commanding attention. He introduced himself as an attorney representing the district. His sudden appearance sent a ripple of confusion through the room. Even Mr. Davis, who had been briefed on the meeting's agenda, hadn't been told to expect legal counsel. "I apologize for the interruption," the attorney began, his tone calm but authoritative. "Given the public attention this matter has received, the district has decided to take additional precautions to ensure all actions are compliant with policy and legal precedent." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard. The attorney continued, pulling out a thick folder. "We've reviewed Mr. Carter's file in detail and have identified a pattern that extends beyond the issue of tardiness. There are concerns regarding his adherence to other policies that have not yet been discussed publicly." Mr. Carter's breath caught in his throat. He knew his record wasn't spotless, no teachers was, but this felt like an ambush. What other policies? He had always done his best, even under challenging circumstances, and hearing these vague accusations felt like a slap in the face. The attorney flipped open the folder, his movements deliberate. For instance, there are instances of unapproved lesson plan deviations, informal counseling sessions with students that were not documented, and unauthorized use of school resources for extracurricular activities. Gasps rippled through the room. Parents looked at each other in confusion, while the students who had come inside as representatives bristled with frustration. Mr. Carter wanted to speak, to defend himself, but he knew he had to stay calm. Any outburst could be used against him. "This isn't about tardiness anymore," the attorney said, his voice sharp. "It's about a pattern of behavior that suggests a disregard for the rules and protocols that are in place to ensure fairness and accountability." The tension in the room skyrocketed. Some parents began whispering among themselves, their initial confidence in the protest wavering. Could there really be more to this story? Had they rallied around someone who had broken more rules than they realized? But the students weren't buying it. One of them, a boy with a confident stance and fire in his eyes, stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady, "but isn't it true that Mr. Carter went out of his way to help students when no one else would? If those informal counseling sessions you're talking about help kids stay out of trouble or get through tough times, how is that a bad thing?" His words hit the room like a spark to dry kindling. The parents who had started to doubt Mr. Carter now nodded in agreement. Others chimed in, echoing the sentiment that the system often failed to provide the support students needed, leaving teachers like Mr. Carter to fill the gaps. The attorney, unshaken, adjusted his tie. Intentions do not justify breaking the rules. If every teacher decided to operate outside the system, chaos would ensue. The policies are there for a reason. Mr. Davis felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He could see the attorney's logic, but something about the approach felt wrong. Was this about justice, or was it about silencing dissent? The way the attorney had introduced these allegations at the 11th hour didn't sit right with him. It felt calculated, like a tactic to discredit Mr. Carter and end the protest without addressing the underlying issues. Outside, the crowd had grown restless. The delay in the meeting's outcome had only fueled their determination. Parents passed out water bottles, and students took turns leading chants. Social media buzzed with updates, photos, and videos, drawing even more attention to the protest. Among the posts, one particularly emotional video began gaining traction, a tearful student sharing how Mr. Carter had helped her navigate her parents' divorce. "Without him, I don't know where I'd be right now," she said, her voice cracking. "He didn't just teach us math or science. He taught us how to believe in ourselves." As the video spread, so did the pressure on the school board. Reporters outside received calls from their networks, urging them to dig deeper into the story. Questions about the district's policies and their treatment of teachers began circulating. What started as a local issue was now teetering on the edge of becoming a national conversation. Back inside, Mr. Carter finally stood. His voice was calm but carried a quiet intensity. "If I've made mistakes, I own them," he said, addressing the room. "But let's be honest, this isn't about me. This is about a system that demands perfection from teachers while giving them little support. I stayed late because students needed someone to talk to. I used my own resources because the school didn't have what we needed. If following the rules means turning my back on my students, then maybe the rules need to change." The room fell silent. Even the attorney seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Mr. Davis felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now: admiration. For all his flaws, Mr. Carter was undeniably committed to his students in a way few others were. But just as it seemed the tide might be turning, another twist emerged. A school board member, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the meeting, cleared her throat. "There's something else we need to consider," she said, her tone cautious. "This isn't just about Mr. Carter. It's about whether our policies are serving the people they're meant to protect. Maybe it's time to reevaluate them." The suggestion was met with a mix of surprise and skepticism. The attorney raised an eyebrow, clearly displeased. "This is neither the time nor the place for policy discussions," he said firmly. "We need to address the matter at hand." But the board member stood her ground. "How can we make a fair decision if we don't examine the bigger picture? These protests aren't just about one teacher, they're about a community that feels unheard. If we don't listen, we're failing them. Her words set off a ripple effect. Other board members began murmuring, and the crowd outside seemed to sense that something significant was happening. The energy in the air shifted, teetering on the edge of resolution or escalation. The room fell into a tense silence after the school board member's bold statement. It was as though everyone present was recalibrating their understanding of what this meeting was really about. Outside, the chants continued, unwavering, as though the community's collective voice was holding up the walls themselves. Mr. Carter sat quietly, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The tide seemed to be turning, but there was still uncertainty hanging in the air. The attorney leaned forward, clearing his throat to reassert control. While these broader issues are valid for discussion, this meeting was convened to address a specific personnel matter. With respect, I suggest we stay focused on the immediate concerns. The board member didn't flinch. Immediate concerns don't exist in a vacuum. The community isn't just reacting to one decision, they're reacting to a pattern, a system that they feel is failing them. Ignoring that context will only escalate tensions. And honestly, can any of us say we've done enough to address these frustrations before now? The attorney opened his mouth to respond, but another board member cut him off. She's right. If we make this decision tonight without addressing the root causes, we're going to have another protest tomorrow. And the day after that. It's time we start listening. Mr. Davis felt the shift in the room and realized that, for the first time, the power to end this conflict wasn't entirely in his hands. He had been trying to follow the rules, to manage the school the way he was supposed to, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the bigger picture. The students, parents, and teachers weren't asking for perfection, they were asking for understanding, for fairness, for a system that cared more about people than policies. I have something to say, Mr. Davis finally interjected, his voice quiet but firm. All eyes turned to him, the room holding its breath. This has been a difficult situation for everyone involved. I've been doing my best to balance the district's expectations with what's right for our school, but I realize now that I've been too focused on following the rules and not enough on listening to the people they affect. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Mr. Carter has his faults, as we all do. But he's also shown an unwavering commitment to his students, even when the system didn't make it easy. Maybe instead of punishing him, we should be asking how we can support teachers like him better. And maybe it's time we take a hard look at the policies that brought us here in the first place. The room was silent for a moment, then murmurs of agreement spread among the board members. The attorney looked displeased but said nothing. It was clear he was losing his grip on the narrative. Outside, the crowd noticed a shift in energy, even without knowing what was happening inside. The chants grew louder, more hopeful, as though they could sense that their voices were making a difference. Students huddled in groups, clutching their signs and refreshing their phones for updates. Parents exchanged glances, some quietly admitting they hadn't expected the protest to gain so much traction. Finally, the board chairwoman stood up, her presence commanding attention. "We've heard enough to make a decision," she said, her voice carrying a mix of authority and weariness. "It's clear this situation is about more than just one teacher's tardiness. It's about trust, accountability, and the kind of community we want to build." She turned to the attorney. "While we respect your role here, this board has the authority to make decisions based on what we believe is in the best interest of our school. And in this case, I believe that means reinstating Mr. Carter, effective immediately." The room erupted into applause, with parents and students cheering loudly. Mr. Carter sat stunned, the weight of the moment washing over him. He hadn't expected this outcome, and now that it was real, he wasn't sure how to feel. Relief, gratitude, and hope all swirled inside him, but so did a lingering sense of responsibility. He would have to live up to the faith these people had placed in him. Outside, the news of the decision spread like wildfire. The crowd's cheers echoed across the campus, a powerful testament to what could happen when a community came together. Students hugged each other, parents wiped away tears, and even the most skeptical observers couldn't deny the power of what they had witnessed. Mr. Davis stepped outside to address the crowd, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something more raw, more human. "I want to thank all of you for showing us what it means to stand up for what you believe in," he said, his voice carrying across the sea of faces. "This has been a learning experience for all of us, and I promise we'll work to make sure your voices are heard, not just today but every day moving forward." As the crowd began to disperse, parents and students stopped to thank Mr. Carter personally. Some handed him handwritten notes, others simply hugged him. Each interaction reinforced his sense of purpose, reminding him why he had become a teacher in the first place. In the weeks that followed, the school began making changes. The district announced a review of its policies, inviting input from teachers, parents, and students. Mr. Davis held town hall meetings to foster open communication, and the school board committed to addressing systemic issues rather than just enforcing rules. For Mr. Carter, life didn't return to normal, it got better. He continued to show up for his students, but now he had the full support of his community. The experience had changed him, too, making him more mindful of how his actions fit into the larger system and more determined to push for improvements where they were needed. The story of what happened at Eastwood High spread beyond their town, becoming a symbol of what could happen when people came together to challenge the status quo. It wasn't a perfect ending, and there were still challenges ahead, but it was a powerful reminder that change was possible, even in the face of adversity.